Hello, my name is Jessie Liu, and today I'm presenting my oral essay plan on the topic of an investigation in the relation of acculturative stress and individuals' mental well-being. The objectives of this presentation is that acculturative stress has a negative impact on individuals' psychological well-being as their identity is challenged throughout their transition into the host country's culture. And before I move on, here is a definition of acculturative stress. It is the stress resulting from the changes and conflicts one faces when being exposed to a non-native culture. Now, source 1 studies the negative influence of acculturative stress on refugee youth mental health. The term refugee differs from immigrants in the circumstance of a forced exit, and children of refugee are often exposed to poor living standard and low quality of education. The study contains a data analysis method which studies 18 previous journal articles, and it also uses an ecological model, which is a system theory that examines the impact of environment on an individual's emotional and behavioral health throughout their lifetime. This model looks at 4 aspects. They are the microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, and macrosystem. And apart from that, individual factors and outcomes are also considered. They include host country language literacy, ethnicity and acculturation differences, namely that white immigrants fit in faster and better than immigrants of color, as well as the salience of ethnic identity. The result of this study is presented in a multi-system outcomes, which focuses on perceived discrimination and mental health concerns. Perceived discrimination appears to drive young immigrants to adapt or assimilate in an effort to avoid being discriminated against. This can lead to lower level of self-esteem, academic and social struggles, and a sense of isolation. And mental health concerns also arise due to humans' lack of ability to easily adjust to, adopt, or resist a new culture. And this can result in identity confusion, familial conflict, and problems at work and school. And clinically, higher levels of PTSD and depressive symptoms are detected. The study also shows that more time spent in the host culture generally alleviates depressive symptoms, which means that more time spent in the host country would help the individual to better adjust and adapt. Now, moving on to source 2. Source 2 is a study of both, source 2 studies the adverse relation between acculturative stress and the psychological well-being of Mexican immigrants and how self-esteem and ethnic identity impact on this relation. So this study introduces 2 types of acculturative stressor. One is American-based acculturative stress, which is stress caused by the pressure from Anglo-Americans to improve one's English skills and acquire American cultural practices and customs. And 2 is Mexican-based acculturative stress, which is stress related to the pressure from other Mexicans to improve one's Spanish skills and to retain Mexican cultural practices and customs. So this study contains the method of survey study, and it is open to 181 self-identified Mexican immigrants as participants, and they age between 23 to 59 years old. The survey measures acculturative stress, both American and Mexican-based, self-esteem, ethnic identity, and psychological well-being. So the result of the study shows that both American-based and Mexican-based acculturative stress are crucial sources of psychological distress. Self-esteem is detected as a desirable trait as it moderates the crippling effect of both types of acculturative stresses against psychological well-being, whereas ethnic identity is undesirable because it exacerbates the negative effect of acculturative stress, and this can be explained by that individuals with high level of group identification are more likely to internalize group threats as a threat to the self, and they're also more likely to oppose to accepting American cultural practice and learning English in specific, which makes them more vulnerable to American-based acculturative stress. And in the end, self-esteem is considered both a moderator and a mediator in this study, and this is explained as self-esteem is negatively affected by acculturative stress, but the retainment of an adequate level of self-esteem also protects individuals from the psychological distress related to acculturation. And evidence 3, so this study talks about the immigrant women's experience of accultural distress in Ireland, in specific, the exclusion from ordinary privileges and overt discrimination, and how it negatively affects their psychological well-being. Similar to the previous one, this one is also a survey study, and all participants of the study satisfy that they're female identifying, they're age 18 or older, and they're non-native resident of Ireland. And the survey measures ordinary privileges, overt discrimination, psychological well-being, which is indicated in psychiatric symptoms, and satisfaction with life. The participants of the study are grouped into 2. So one is visible immigrant women of colour, and the other is non-visible white immigrant women. And as expected, not all ethnic groups experience the same type or magnitude of acculturative stresses. So immigrant women who belong to a visible ethnic group are exposed to more overt discrimination and experience fewer ordinary privileges. And this experience reflects in the high tendency of immigrants of colour to show depressive symptoms. And what this study exceeds the previous ones is that it has this discovery regarding to ordinary privilege. So basically the magnitude of indirect effect of ordinary privileges was just as strong as that of the overt discrimination in both psychiatric symptoms and satisfaction with life. Ordinary privileges are also are often overlooked on a day-to-day basis in comparison to discrimination, but ordinary privileges are an important social resource that convey social respect. They protect some, but not others, from psychological distress. And finally, on to the evaluation of evidence. Source 1 being a meta-analysis, it is applicable around all different ethnic groups and cultures, and is also highly reliable as it is a combined study of previous studies that are already peer-reviewed and fact-checked. And all sources referenced in Source 1 are published later than 2000, which means that they have a relatively high timeliness and reliability. However, there is no consideration of non-English written sources, which means that the results predominantly represents only immigrants living in Western country and culture. And Source 2 and 3, they both share the strength of having first-hand data from direct participation of immigrants in their survey study. And both source reports that they have multilingual survey that is offered to the participants, which breaks down the language barrier and ensures higher reliability in the result. However, they both have bias selection because they're both community-based research. In particular, in the Mexico study, the participants are mostly recruited from a metropolitan area with a large Latino population, which means that in general, the participants have a stronger ethnic identity. Whereas in the island study, it is reported that women from a certain cultural background are only allowed to participate in the research if their husbands give them permission, which means that some of the women are do not have the access to the study, which makes the results not representative of all women in the situation. What differs between Source 2 and 3 is that Source 3 contains the inclusiveness of multiple ethnic groups, whereas Source 2 only studies the Mexican immigrants in America. And finally, regarding on the research on women only, I've chosen this source to study because gender is an important factor in the acculturation experience. This can be argued both ways. Some scholars believe that minority men experience disproportionately more racial discrimination than the minority women, while others argue that minority women experience double jeopardy, which means they're discriminated based on both the fact that they're female and they're coloured. On the other hand, women also tend to be more affected by vicarious exposure to discrimination. This has to do with women's traditional domestic role, as they're more vulnerable and more likely to experience fear when their male partners and children face overt discrimination, which means that the study of women, immigrant women, can also reflect some aspects of the challenges faced by male immigrants. And of course, the limitation of study on women only lies in that the results should not be generalized to male immigrants for obvious reasons. And in conclusion, acculturative stress experienced by immigrants and refugees has an adverse impact on their mental well-being. Ultimately, experience of overt discrimination, language barrier, the challenge of ethnic identity from both intergroup and intragroup, inadequate level of self-esteem, and loss of ordinary privileges are all factors of acculturation that contribute to depressive symptoms and post-traumatic stress. And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening.